Anita, how's your mental health?
Questionable at all times. You know this.
Yeah, how's the mental health of your children?
Also a little bit tricky. Can I tell you my experience in trying to find therapists for myself and my kids, Mel?
Yes, please.
Okay, this is how it goes. You ask around your friends and your family for a referral for somebody who's nearby. You finally find somebody who sounds like they might work for your family. You give them a call and you find out that A, they're not accepting new patients, or B, they have a huge wait list. So you start over again and you ask people if they know anybody who would be a good therapist and a good fit. Finally, you find one, you go and you meet with them, and you figure out that you don't actually like them that much. But it's been so much work to find somebody who you can go to in your area that you're kind of stuck with them. Well, do you have any ideas for how to get around this?
I do because guess what? I've actually had some therapists that I have found on my own, which involves what you're saying. Sometimes I remember one time I was like 3 hours in the bathtub on my phone looking
Yeah.
through websites. I was such a prune at the end. But I have also had the experience with working with BetterHelp. And it was like, I don't want to say too good to be true, but because it is true, but it's like amazing because I was matched with my therapist within 24 hours.
And you didn't have to go through all of that other ridiculous process of trying to find somebody. And here's the cool thing too, is if that person didn't work out for you, you can just switch and say, and it's not like you're committing to another years long search for somebody who you're going to jive with.
It's true. And I lucked out, or maybe just BetterHelp is really good at matching people together because I never had to change my therapist. I loved her. Perfect fit for me. And I know that some of our friends have used BetterHelp and they've had to change therapists, and boom, same day, you can change.
Easy peasy.
You can ghost your therapist. Get a new one.
I love this idea. BetterHelp is one of our sponsors. If you use our promo code trybetterhelp.com/WWDN, you get 10% off your first month. And we totally recommend it.
Yes, get some therapy. That's trybetterhelp.com/WWDN. Sit, lay, whatever.
Is Scotty going to be the host of today's podcast?
He's totally going to be the host.
He
Scotty,
looks like it.
say something. I think he is distracted by the birds outside of the window. So I guess it's me and you, Anito.
Sorry, guys. You're stuck with us again. Wow. It's wow. That's all I have to say about this week.
Also, same here. Wow.
Yeah. Where to begin, where to end, I don't even know.
Who should start? We both have a lot.
I don't know.
Maybe we should just skip it and like go get tacos.
I think so. Mel, tell us your stories.
Well, a lot of mine I still can't share because it's not mine. Maybe one day all details will come out, but
Maybe.
it's just so stressful. It's very life and death. It's very terrifying. I hate to be cryptic. I have to be right now. But so there was like very dramatic and scary stuff that happened. And then my mom and my sister got in a car accident right after that. And I had some trauma triggers, and my mom was having a hard time this week because of all of the stressful things. And she's just like, I need my person. Like, can't I just be a widow? That's hard enough. And I was like, I know.
So sorry.
I know. So we've just had a lot of things like that. I kind of did a little spiral back into some PTSD. And then whenever that happens, I get mad that I spiral into PTSD. And then I have to remind myself, you have a brain. You have had very, very hard compounding trauma for a long time. It's okay. This is your brain trying to survive. What tools do we have? So I am just like, okay, I guess here we go again for the 970th time. When I notice that my brain is starting to get into thought patterns of like very negative ruminating sorts of things, I finally was catching those thoughts and was like, oh, I see what's happening. I don't want to live in this part of that. So I'm going to have a sentence that I say every time that I think. Like I'm going to try and replace it. And it sucks and it's hard work and it's like so many times a day, but I did notice a difference. And so the last couple days I've been pulling out of it a little more. The other thing is I have not been in need of taking any of my rescue anxiety meds for a couple weeks. So I was like,
Wow.
yes, this is awesome. And then all this stuff happened. And when things happen in my life, they're stacked for some reason. There's just so much that all happens at once. And I was like, no, I don't want to take it. No, I don't want to take it. And then my friend was like, Mel, your mental health is important. Is it going to help you? And I'm like, I guess so. But like, I thought I was doing so good. And I was like, okay. And I took it later and I was like, yep. All right. My friend was right. I had to end up canceling a day of teaching just to kind of reset. And now I'm doing okay, kind of on the upward trend, but still not feeling great. But I'm here. Yes, Anita.
Can we please tell everybody that when we were supposed to be on our call today, my dad was at your house drilling something?
Listen, Randall, and I are bros. And he's helping me to kind of make some final changes on my little quarter pipe skate ramps that are in the basement in the house. And we hung out today for like 3 hours.
Oh my gosh.
Back and forth to his house and his workshop. And then we went up and we had some interesting conversations, which actually has to do with your stuff. So it's your turn.
Oh, golly. You're going to have to tell me what he said. I'm sure it'll be interesting. So the bomb that went off in my life this week was that one of my kids has been diagnosed with autism, which I've had about 3.5 million conflicting feelings about. And it just feels like a lot to process and deal with and think about the future. And the way it all came about was really, I don't know, strange and almost like it was meant to happen that way. But also I've been beating myself up for not catching on earlier. And in talking with this therapist, she was saying that it really sucks that Jason died right kind of in the years maybe that it would have been caught if it would have been. And it's just like we were in such turmoil and everything was just, oh, it's grief, it's grief, it's grief, it's grief, that some of these things were just kind of pushed aside and blamed on that. And so I'm trying to be nice to myself about it. I actually feel a lot of relief in a lot of ways, because so many things are explained and it just feels different. But then there's a lot of questions about the future and I feel like I don't have the energy to learn a new way of doing things, right? Like somebody said to me, well, Anita, you've been trying to use a hammer for a screwdriver job and it's going to take less energy to use the screwdriver, right? And I'm like, but I have to learn to be a screwdriver. And that's overwhelming to think about doing by yourself. So that was my like, whew.
Bomb.
Talking to him about it and him being like, I don't think that, he's not bought in yet. And I think that it will really help him when he buys into it as well, because I've been trying to point out behaviors where I'm like, this could be that. And he's like, no. Cause it's hard to be told that you're not quote unquote normal, and for a kid that age
or typical.
Well, that's why quote unquote, because that's, we haven't learned language around that yet. And in his mind, somebody with autism is a very specific thing, right? And he doesn't want to be associated with somebody who's really impaired. And I can understand that. And he doesn't understand the whole idea of the spectrum thing yet. So that's my
question
that I'm dealing with. Mm-hmm.
Did you tell him that I have autism?
No, actually, we did not talk about that at all.
I'm wondering if that might help him to see, like, in the start of the spectrum conversation or have a different viewpoint,
He's been warming up to the idea a little bit. And I think it's going to be good. Like, I think it's going to be a really good thing. And even just my change in mindset, like, because he'll have these big explosions about things that I just can't wrap my head around. And it's been like, oh, I don't need to wrap my head around it. Like, he's having this explosion. He's having this meltdown about something that makes no sense. And It just is what it is,
Yeah.
you know, and I don't have to try and convince him or teach him or show him or point out the logic fallacy or whatever. I can just be like, you're really upset about this. And I don't have to try and make any sense of it.
Yeah, you don't have to have the same wiring as his brain or figure out his wiring in the same way to
Or
like
fix it. You know?
Yeah. So this is actually what your dad and I had been talking about, which is why we were a little late. Because your dad started showing me this clock thing, gear thing. I don't know what it is.
Oh, yeah, the clocks.
He showed me this thing that was very logical and organized in his mind. And I'm like, okay, I understand like that you understand that. And I also don't understand those things.
None of us understand it. Just
but
so
then, okay. But then he was talking about my brain too, because I brought up what you had just discovered, you know, had the diagnosis. And so we started talking about like neurodivergent brains and stuff like that. And I think that's one reason your dad and I get along really well, because we both are kind of in that neurodivergency category. And we, even though we don't understand each other's stuff, we understand that our brains work differently. So then we were talking about your child and we're like, I wonder what he's going to end up gravitating towards, or like, you know, it's going to take a while, but he was showing me some stuff that he was trying to help him conceptualize. And he was like, look at here is how organized his brain is in this category. So, I mean, this is just, and I'm like, I totally get it. We had some conversations about it, and I know it's like not ideal for you to have this be happening. And there are going to be a lot of, you know, things to kind of work around. But at the same time, like that, the downfalls of his situation may also end up being strengths.
Yeah.
In the long run. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. And I'm sorry that it's just an extra thing for you to deal with. But I think that I'm serious. I think he should come skateboard with me because, and you should tell him about Rodney Mullen.
I don't know who that is.
Well, guess
Rodney
what?
Mullen.
You should Google
it.
Is he a skateboarder? Skateboarder on the spectrum. He's like an innovator of a bunch of street skateboard tricks. And so it's like, I don't know, maybe he'll like that. Maybe he'll end up gravitating towards something where he can use his body or like he can conceptualize certain things. So
yeah, I mean, I already know some of his like weird quirks and strengths, and it will be interesting. The funniest thing was when I told my daughter, he doesn't want my younger sons to know, because in like they also have that very
narrow.
Very narrow definition, and it's not a good thing to them. And he doesn't want people to think of him as defective or whatever. And so I said, well, can I tell your sister? Because she's older and she can, you know, she understands more. And so I sat down, I talked to my daughter, and she's like, duh, mom. And I just think it's funny. Like, we just have grown up so, you know, so differently. And then she said the cutest thing. And I was like, I love that so much. She's like, Mom, he's just got a touch of the tism. And I was like, that's totally true. Like, he's mostly normal, and then not normal. He's mostly typical.
Good
and
job.
Then just has some very strange little pieces of his personality. So anyway, it was really cute.
It's funny because there are some things where I'm like, oh yeah, like we both like these same things. And I'm like, so then when you told me that, I was like, oh, duh, he's one of us. He's one of me and Randy Randall and a lot of my artist friends. So we'll take him.
And Rodney Dangerfield. Rodney McMullen.
Rodney Mullen.
Rodney Mullen.
Yeah. Send him to my house. We're going to skateboard. It's going to be fine.
Sometimes we assume that unless we had a huge life insurance payout, we don't really need to know anything about investments or even finances. But guess what? A little knowledge of finances is critical for all of us. Maybe your partner was in charge of that stuff, and now you find yourself making all the decisions. Maybe you're mad about that. Maybe I am. Nicole from the He's Gone But the Money's Not podcast is here to help. She tackles financial literacy by telling the stories of women and widows and finance experts, and shares the lessons they've learned as certified financial planners. Whether you know a lot and feel confident in your financial decisions or feel unsure about all of that stuff, there is more to learn. Listen and subscribe to the He's Gone But the Money's Not podcast on all podcast platforms. This ad was paid for by Rockhouse Financial, an SEC-registered investment advisor. Oh man, he'll break both of his wrists. I shouldn't have said that.
We'll get him some wrist guards. So we have Zooms this weekend, you guys, facilitated by our friend Autumn Barker, and they are going to be 12 noon Mountain Time and 6 p.m. Mountain Time.
It's daylight savings this weekend sometime, isn't it?
Gosh. Yeah, but the day after.
Yeah. I'm going to be doing a bike race on Saturday, and I hope that I come back from it, just so you know. It's going to be horrible.
And I have a 2-day recording session, so I'll be with my neurodivergent friends. If you are wondering where to find the Zoom links, they are going to be in the Widow Wives Club on Facebook in the events tab and in our app. Make sure you go to the App Store and download the Widow We Do Now app, and it's in Calendar.
Okay. So convenient, Mel.
Yeah, thank you.
So convenient. Mel and I have had kind of a crazy week, and we've actually recorded some episodes that have been pretty heavy, and we need your help to have some levity and some light and something that's not so horrible. So we need you guys to submit some more stories, and this time what we're looking for is funny or maybe not so funny, terrible, awkward things that have happened because of widow brain. Like,
yes,
did you put your car keys in the freezer? You know, just like the weird things. Did you forget a really important appointment? Things that turned out to be kind of funny because your brain is just not functioning.
Yeah. Did you wear your underwear outside and forget to put pants on?
Yes,
stuff like
we need
that.
those stories.
Please send those to us at widowwedonow@gmail.com, or you can message us in Facebook or Instagram, right?
Yeah,
Like
but please just send us some stories to bring the levity up a little bit, because we're both struggling.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting that it's taken us to this point in the podcast to like have all that happen, right? But we've also had kind of a lot going on in our lives. But yeah, there have been some interviews that are going to be very good. There are just some really hard things about them. So we know that if we're both like having some feelings, then like, okay, it's difficult. So yeah. So expect some smattering of some fun content, some lighthearted content in between some of the interviews that may be a little bit more complex and difficult. There you go.
Also, you guys come check out the Widow Wives Club. We announced last week that we've opened up some subgroups, and we've got a little bit of steam going on those, but come and join those subgroups. It's a really great place to talk about specific circumstances that happen within the widowhood community. We've got groups for parents and empty nesters and no kids, as well as a group for suicide, addiction, those complicated grief type situations. We've got a bunch more, but those are just a few of those. You'll find those on Facebook. You have to be a member of the Widow Wives Club to join those subgroups. So make sure you're in the Widow Wives Club first, and then find the subgroups. They're amazing.
Yeah. And some of them are like not based on circumstance. It's just like travel, recipes, stuff like that. So join us.
If you want to keep the podcast going, check out our Patreon. It's patreon.com/WWDN. It's just a way to support the podcast and keep it going.
Yeah. We have 4 tiers. At the Widow Bestie level and up, you get a shout out in episode and ad-free content. So please join. And we're going to do our Patreon shout out right now.
All right. For our first secret dead husband, we're going to say, there she was, just a walking down the street singing, widow, 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 woo.
Constance Dahlbeck. Congrats, Constance.
Oh, David Kelly.
Don Satterwhite.
Emily Wesenberg.
Evelyn Flores.
Gail Bell.
Heather Mullins.
Ivan the Misner.
Kat. Krista, the scammer magnet. Wait.
Maya Glasser.
Neil Hooper.
Rebecca Ziba.
Sam Finlayson.
Karen Cornejo.
Alexis King Audello.
Amber Alanez Vela.
Amy Hartman Martell.
Amy Neal.
Ashley Hahn.
Barbara Schneeberger.
Berkeley.
Brandy Younger.
Brittany Pedro.
Chris Steffen.
Cindy Wilkerson.
Connie Remich.
Danielle Catterberg.
Not a Debbie Downer.
Dennis Brazo.
Jean Marie Massey.
J2,
Jenny Taylor,
Jennifer Beal,
Jennifer Brown,
Jesse Johnson,
Carol Schultz,
Laura Aguirre Penner,
Leah Johnston,
Lisa Hardman Powell,
Luke Lawson,
Auntie Marie Hoffman, happy birthday,
MK Anderson,
Meg Murdo,
Patricia Weist,
Rachel Barbosa,
Sarah Morris,
Simone Fu,
Sunshine Haven,
Alicia McAllister,
Amy Burke,
Ann Drennan,
Anna Tracy,
Audrey Henniger,
Serena Bohr,
Christina Scambato,
Christine Anderson,
Cindy Raynaud,
Dawn Barber,
Debbie Fells,
Deborah Westwood,
Diana Becker,
Doris Reichel.
Is that how you say it?
No,
It's different
probably
every
not.
time. Okay.
We're doing our best.
Eileen Stevens Dem.
Emily Toledo.
Eric Vandermeulen, the skate god.
Aaron Posick.
Gabe Lozano.
Gia Benoit.
Gina Haas.
Ian Sini.
Jackie Coyle.
Jan Colarusso Seeley.
Jane.
Another secret one.
Jennifer Davis.
Jenny Armstrong.
Jennifer Sanders.
Jenny Barrow.
Jenny Dippold.
Jocelyn Milo.
AKA Jesus. Johnny Walker.
Judy Malkin.
Julie Stevenson.
Karen Ochoa.
Karina Jacobo.
Kathy Murray.
Katie Getz.
Katie Radcliffe.
Kara Scara.
Love to you. Kevin Ferry.
Chris Morgan.
Lara Keeley.
Lauren Old.
Linda.
Lindsay S. Kanopka.
Marjorie Lewis.
Marianne Hammond.
Marianne McDonald.
Mary McGowan.
Melissa Bowers.
Melissa Hancock.
Oh, Missy Mulestein.
Our child. Is it Mulestein or Mulestein?
I know another person. Her last name's Mulestein, but I don't know how they say it.
Okay, well, it looks German. I'm going to say Mulestein. Hey, Missy, text us. Naomi Brown.
Rachel Tang.
Rebecca Olemaker.
Robin Flam.
Stacy Saywert.
Tammy Terravest.
Tara Wallace.
Trenton Thompson.
Valerie Packer.
And finally, we have too old, too fat to ski Wendy.
No! It's all in your mind, Wendy.
Too bad your feet are so small.
Thanks to everybody who has joined our Patreon. We appreciate you so much and could not do this without you. If you don't want to join the Patreon, but want to support the podcast, please get us tacos, please.
Buy me a taco. No. It's buymeacoffee.com/widow we do now.
And if you don't want to do any of those, please give us a 5-star rating on Apple Podcast and write a nice review. It helps people to see the podcast and to see that we're not complete a-holes. Unless you think we are, then just don't say anything. Just don't listen.
I can just hear my mom saying, if you don't have anything nice to say, don't say anything at
I heard my
all.
mom say that too in my mind. Jinx.
All right. Should we get to the episode?
Yes, and you guys are going to love Adeline. She's so great, and we are grateful to her for sharing her story with us.
And licorice is delicious. Thanks, Adeline. All right. I'm Anita.
Wait, she sent you licorice?
She sent me these weird licorice balls.
Wait, I want some. Adeline! Thought we were friends. Fine. Go.
I'm Anita.
I'm Mel without licorice.
You can have some of mine. We're two young widows. We're two young widows. We're just trying to help you figure out widow.
We
do.
Now. Just kidding, Adeline. We can still be friends. This episode is sponsored by the Misner Family Foundation in memory of Elisabeth Misner.
Here we go. It's time for a new and exciting interview. We're really excited to talk to this person today because she has kind of a different experience than a lot of us have had. So it's going to be fun.
We've met her in real life. She's super cool. She even ditched a different class to come to our class at Camp Widow. And she sat on the front row, totally took one for the team because no one sits on the front row ever. Please introduce yourself, amazing guest.
That was an amazing intro right there. My name's Adeline Grenier. I am, should I just start with saying I'm a widow? I guess that's why I'm here. And I am based just outside of Seattle, Washington.
Adeline, how old are you?
I am 41. I forget. I remember all my kids' birthdays, but I forget my own.
She had to pause for a second and looked up at the sky. And I think everybody who has widow brain can understand that feeling. And also, time is weird when you're a widow, right?
So since you mentioned it, how many kids do you have?
So I have three kids. They are 8, 5, and 2. Note that I'm still looking out the window trying to remember their ages. And I was widowed 2 years ago. My kids at that time were a couple days over 6 years old, 3 years old, and 10 months old.
Ah!
Jeez. So you are not originally from the United States, correct?
That is correct. So we are all Canadian, my family and I. I grew up in Vancouver, BC, just across the border from Seattle. I work in a job that's very rotational. And so every few years, every 2 to 4 years, I actually move cities or I move countries. So we've been in Seattle now for about 3.5 years. And we moved to Seattle from Copenhagen in Denmark. And previous to that, I was in Ottawa. Before that was in Vancouver and China and Taiwan and a whole lot of other places. So there's been a lot of movement. Not all of it has been with my kids, obviously. And my husband, who I guess we'll get into in a sec, joined me kind of halfway through all of these travels and, was absolutely willing to, pick up his bags and travel with me in kind of our adventure.
So you live in Seattle. Does that mean that you eat Beecher's cheese ever?
I do. It's not as squeaky. So my husband was from Quebec, and so Quebec's really known for squeaky cheese for the like poutine and stuff. And so Beecher's is not quite as squeaky as the Canadian Quebec version. But I do eat it because it's just nice to munch on cheese because cheese is great.
I want to ask about Denmark and living in Denmark. Was it amazing?
It was amazing. Like, so we moved here in 2019 and we'd been in Denmark for 4 years prior. And without knowing what happened once we moved here in Seattle and everything, it was probably the best 4 years that we could have had as a family. And it had, a great place to have and to raise children. It was a great place to explore Europe. It had so many good things going for it. I think a lot of people know it as, like the happiest place on earth and these, really kind of interesting stereotypes. But I think a lot has to be said about kind of the level of contentment and happiness that they have in Denmark. Copenhagen was a very small city where you biked everywhere, so you felt like you were getting fresh air all the time. You biked safely everywhere, which was nice. They had like elevated bike lanes, and it was just a really nice place to be a family and to be ourselves and to raise children.
So in Copenhagen is the best of times. But now we need to know about the worst of times. Why don't, before you get into that, you tell us about your person and let us know who he was, how you met, what you love about him.
What it was like being married to a Quebecois?
Yeah, total Quebecois. So his name was Francis. Although we spoke in French, so I would say Francis, and in English, we often would say Frank. So I might use the two names interchangeably. We actually met in Vancouver because I had gone to Vancouver for a few years of work. And he had been living there for a few years. We met through mutual friends. He and I were both ultimate Frisbee players, and that's how we met. And then kind of we discovered that we had a lot of things in common. We're both very outdoorsy. We both liked adventures. We both like kind of just jumping in a car and doing something interesting. We were pretty willing to see where things went. I think our first date, I said, listen, kind of how my work goes. I have to move around a lot. Are you willing to do this with me? Because I didn't want to invest too much in a relationship if someone wasn't willing to be on board. And he jumped on board right away. And we always had each other's back. It was a wonderful relationship and partnership, and somehow everything, we always got along. We never discussed a lot of things, and we always kind of had the same mind with most of our big decisions, which made it a lot easier when it came to big life decisions like which country we're going to move to next.
So in Quebec, where is he from? Is he from Quebec City or Montreal? Wait, is Montreal in Quebec?
Montreal is in Quebec. Yeah, he's from a small town called Thetford Mines. It's just an hour south of Quebec City.
So what year did you guys end up getting married?
So we met in 2009 and we got married in 2013. And that was the last thing we did on the West Coast before we moved. And we got married in this small town called Ucluelet up in Vancouver Island. Great surfing town in Tofino, if anyone wants to go surfing. The song Surfing in Tofino is on Vancouver Island. And that's where we got married. And so our 10-year anniversary will be this year.
So you guys got married, and then where did you move to? Where was the next place that you had ventured off to?
Yeah, so we got married, and then a month later we moved to Ottawa. And that's where our first child, Felix, was born. And then we had Oscar in Denmark. And then our youngest, I was pregnant with her when we discovered that Frances had cancer, and she was going to be born in the US, and then in the end she was born in Canada because we kind of, with his treatment, everything got shifted to Canada instead of here.
So tell us what happened to Frances.
6 weeks after we arrived in Seattle, 1 week after our actual shipment had arrived. So just to give you an idea of kind of how disorganized we were and how kind of discombobulated I think we were, none of our boxes were unpacked. Everything was kind of still getting settled. He started having trouble breathing, and he had trouble sleeping, and he couldn't breathe while he was lying down. So while we were on a trip, he kind of went to kind of an acute care, and they took some kind of x-ray of his chest and discovered that he had a mass. And they weren't sure what it was, but between that and his blood test, they essentially sent him back to Seattle to get tested right away. And that's when he was diagnosed with leukemia, acute lymphoblastic leukemia, ALL to be exact. And he had like a particularly bad case because he had a mass, because he had T-cell, which has no, I found out later that it has kind of no clinical trials or any kind of treatment after remission. Because he was of a certain age, it was considered to be quite rare. And so they couldn't, because it's normally what he had is a childhood leukemia. It came on quite quickly. So between kind of the scans that he had had while we were on travel, and then 6 days later up here in Seattle, his mass had already grown. So they pretty much kind of got him in the hospital, and he started chemo the next day without even knowing exactly what type of leukemia it was. In total, the time that we had was 15 months from diagnosis to his death.
So I have two questions. One is easy, one is more complicated. What year was he diagnosed?
So this was in October 2019, and we had just arrived in Seattle at the end of August 2019.
Okay. So what you're telling me is that you're going to go into a pandemic with cancer, and then you're going to lose him during a pandemic.
Yes. I'm also going to add a couple other things in there.
Okay. No, this is enough. You're cut off. You can't have any more complications.
So the day that he was diagnosed was also the day that I had to go in for my 20-week scan because I was pregnant. And of course, he was supposed to come with me, but he was in the hospital. And I pretty much spent the entire scan just crying and crying. And the poor tech was clearly not expecting this, because I was on the phone talking to someone trying to explain what was happening. One of my family members is a doctor, a cousin. And she goes, "Oh, is this your dad?" And I was like, "No, this is my husband, the father of, said baby that's on the screen." And she just, I felt so bad, but I couldn't, what was I to do? So I also went through caregiving while pregnant, which was a whole other thing because my OBGYN was quite concerned that I wasn't taking care of myself, because my main priority was on my husband, and then it was on my 2 other children. And then I wasn't eating. I wasn't taking the time to actually eat and to be healthy. And it wasn't until I think she mentioned it a few weeks later and was like, "Listen, your baby's not growing as fast as she should be. You need to eat." And so at that point, I think I mostly like subsisted on chocolate and cheese. So she grew in some way. She might have a really bad sweet tooth and love cheese, but we'll see. And then, as I mentioned, I'm Canadian and my insurance is also Canadian, and it doesn't quite match up with the way insurance is. Well, firstly, everything's free in Canada. That's a whole other story. But the way that my Canadian insurance was recognizing all of the American billing wasn't matching up. And so during this entire period, to add to everything else, it wasn't recognizing parts of the treatment that Frances needed that would have been covered in Canada, but it's medically coded differently here in the US. It's because the coding was wrong, not wrong, but wasn't matching up with the way the coding is done in Canada, which in the end, we don't see a bill anyways in Canada. They were refusing to cover his treatment here in the US. So at about 2 months into his treatment here, and I was about 30 weeks pregnant, we started talking about maybe having to move back up to Canada in order to cover his treatment. And we could have, and we tried to kind of argue our way through the various insurances, like the underwriters and the providers and my employer, but then he just didn't have time. Frances didn't. And this got us into about January of 2020. And all of the people that I just mentioned that deal with healthcare were also looking at an incoming pandemic, and they were seeing how that was coming through. And I was starting to see that our case was becoming less and less of a concern for them because, of course, the pandemic was coming through. And so finally in February, mid-February, my husband flew back to Canada. I could not because I was 38 weeks pregnant. I drove up to Canada at 38 weeks pregnant, found myself a hospital and a doctor, and then gave birth a week later. My husband, luckily, he met me. He had to fly to another city in Canada, and then he flew and met me in Vancouver because, of course, I couldn't fly out east. But he went and he saw his family really quickly and then met me in Vancouver so that he could continue his treatment. So we had to change his treatment. I had to change my doctor and find a place to give birth. Luckily, I'm from Vancouver, so we just essentially arrived at my parents' home with 2 children and said, we're here. I'm going to do my maternity leave. He's going to do his treatment before his stem cell transplant. I have to say that throughout all of this, because that I have moved around a lot and because that my life has always been a lot of change, it was just another change. It was a crappy one that it forced onto us. And that's kind of how I also feel about widowhood. But it wasn't as kind of untethering. I thought that's maybe also not another word, as it could have been, I guess, because, we had just arrived in Seattle, but I felt that I could get help elsewhere because I knew people from other places as we kind of moved around, and I could find some kind of support, even if it was just virtual support.
So this was going to be my other question. It's got to be so aggravating to be, how far is Seattle away from Canada? 150 miles?
It's about a 3-hour drive.
Okay. A 3-hour drive. And if you're 3 hours north, you don't have to worry about any of this financial nonsense. And you're kind of stuck down here dealing with all of this stuff and just thinking if we were just in Canada, all of this would be a non-issue. Like, I would be so aggravated by that.
I can't, I'm still dealing with hospital bills and stuff like that from when he was alive. And he's been gone 2 years now. And we were in Canada for 9 months in total. And there was not one bill. I mean, we had to pay for the medication, but it's very similar to here where the pharmacies already have kind of your insurance information. So we had to pay for some of the medication up until he reached kind of the a special number that afterwards we didn't have to pay anymore. But I never saw anything, and I saw both sides, right? Like just the aggravation and that stress that you have to deal with your person's illness. And then I was caregiving 2 other children. His mother came down to help out, which was wonderful and very helpful. But, I was still kind of managing the house and all of his medical treatments and his medications and all that kind of thing. And then a bunch of bills on top of it. And you're like, I don't have time for this. This is not of importance. So it's been really kind of eye-opening to see it as a Canadian living here in the US.
Yeah, I I have a lot of things to say about that, but the other thing is that if you remember back to the beginning of the pandemic, Seattle was kind of the touch point of the US pandemic. So it was starting to get hot there before it got hot in a lot of other places. And so you guys just happened to be where the spear tip was coming in. And then you're dealing with cancer. And like you said, it was like everybody is scared and the healthcare system is kind of like, how do we prepare for this? And it just must have been, that's just a lot to deal with. Just too a lot.
Yeah,
For everybody.
it was a lot. In one way, I think because when he was diagnosed with cancer, we had already shrunk. Well, frankly, we knew very few people in Seattle. That's what happens when you just move to a new place. So, the only people we really knew were the parents of the kids that my son went to school with. But even then, like we shrunk down kind of the people that we saw, it went essentially from like 2 people to 0, basically, before the pandemic. So we didn't really feel like we were seeing too many people anyways. I did all the school drop-offs. We were really careful with kind of making sure that he would stay healthy. But, as soon as he had to travel and he had to take a flight back to Canada in mid-February, there was that anxiety. And then we were really lucky in that when the kind of time came up to try and find a stem cell donor for him, that there were a couple of people who were local, close by to Vancouver, at least local enough, because at that point they still, they didn't know if they could send kind of these types of materials kind of across borders. They weren't sure about getting people into hospitals because there's kind of treatment that you would do for the donors of the stem cells before that they would actually donate their or extract the stem cells. So there was all of these questions that were happening, and it was right at the beginning of the pandemic when people were trying to avoid going out, avoid going to hospitals, avoid doing all of these things. And then, here's someone who's knocking on your door, metaphorical door, going, hey, are you willing to try this? Are you willing to, come in and take a bunch of medications and boost up your stem cell production for it to be extracted, right? So we were really lucky in that we did find some donors to even try the transplant.
So he had the transplant, but you mentioned that he went back not back into remission. You unremission? What is it called?
Yeah, it's a relapse. So he had his transplant on, and people think of a transplant in like an organ transplant, like a full like liver or a full like organ. But for a stem cell, it's actually it's like a pouch of liquid material that kind of just gets put into an IV. And so he had his on May 14th, 2020. And he had been in the hospital for a week prior to kind of try and really get rid of all the cancer in his body and so that he was like a clean slate, basically, before they put in the new stem cells. He was originally supposed to stay in the hospital for 6 weeks to recover. And I should mention that he wasn't a match. So they try to do stem cell transplants in which he's a match with a sibling. And so they will test the siblings ahead of time to see if they're matched. He wasn't. So that's why we had to go with kind of a donor. He was supposed to be in the hospital for 6 weeks. He had a bunch of complications, not the most serious ones, but enough that he had to stay in the hospital for 12 weeks. And this was during the pandemic. So of course I couldn't visit at all. I would drop off like clean clothes because, again, he wasn't doing laundry in the hospital. I would drop off clean clothes. We would try to, do some video chats, but sometimes he just didn't feel ready or up for it with any kind of energy. I had a newborn, basically. Don't forget, my daughter was born in February of 2020. So I had a newborn plus my 2 older kids who were 2 and 5 at the time. My parents were helpful, of course, but it just meant for a very kind of busy summer 2020. And he was discharged in August or end of July 2020. And he found out that he had gotten remission in August of 2020. So at kind of 100 days after post-transplant, they do all your tests again. And that's when he found out he was in remission. And that was probably his best month, was August 2020. He started kind of getting headaches and some other kind of smaller symptoms in about September. But because he had just gotten his remission, they couldn't find anything wrong. He just, and with a stem cell transplant, it can take months or even years to kind of recover from that. So we were hopeful that it wasn't anything serious, that it was just, a little, what I call it was just a little blip, right? Like a little blip in our lives. And then in October, we got a call from the hospital and they said, we've seen something funny or something odd with your blood. You should come in. You should bring your wife. And during a pandemic when no one else was allowed in the hospital and they tell you to bring your wife, that's not a great sign. And it was because I feel like every cancer widow has these kind of milestone dates. It was the exact same day as his diagnosis day a year before. So he was diagnosed and relapsed on the same day in October. As I mentioned before, it was T-cell leukemia, and they had no more treatments after relapse. They had no more treatments. They had no clinical trials. All the clinical trials were meant for B-cell and not T-cell. And so they weren't sure what to do. We sent some bone marrow down to a lab in California that was doing some kind of cool treatments in which they would take his bone marrow and they would see kind of with different mixes of medication what might target the cancer the best. And what they came up with was a treatment for a different type of leukemia, or maybe it was lymphoma. But in Canada, they couldn't give that to the patient because it wasn't for the right type of cancer. But in the US, they had started trying to see if that would work. So then we packed up again and came back down to the US. And I should mention that at this entire time, Canada and US had closed their borders. There was also quarantine requirements. And so if you went back and forth between, I can't remember if Washington had quarantine requirements. They did for a while. Canada definitely did. And so if you crossed between the borders, you had to quarantine. And I couldn't even cross across the border because then I would have to quarantine for my children for 2 weeks. And so this was the first time was 9 months later in November of 2020. Because we all had valid visas for the US and we were Canadian citizens, we were allowed to cross the border over land. It was like the quietest border crossing I've ever seen. There was no one. And so we came back here and he started trying a new treatment. And so by this point, the cancer had come back. His cancer was always aggressive. That was why he needed the stem cell transplant in the first place. And his cancer never went away, even before he got his stem cell transplant. There was always enough trace of cancer that it was concerning for the doctors. So throughout his entire treatment, we hoped and we, hoped for the best, but it always came back. And so when it came back at this point, from relapse to the day he died, was 10 weeks. And it was a painful 10 weeks to watch.
So at some point in time, he knew that he was not going to beat the cancer, that he was going to die from the cancer. So at that point in time, did you guys have a discussion? How open were you about the prospect of it actually taking his life? And how open were you with the kids about that?
So my husband loves to organize things. Like, I think his brain works like an Excel sheet. And then he Excel sheets our life. If our house could be Excel sheeted in all of the different ways he organizes the house, it would be in an Excel sheet. So he went along with the new treatment. He was like, okay, let's try it. Let's see how it goes. But at that point, each time that he had chemo, it weakened his body to such a point that he would get sick from other things. And it was kind of an accumulation of everything that made him sicker. And for someone who was so healthy and so in tune with their body, I think that was what frustrated him the most. And I think he felt very kind of betrayed by his body that was no longer able to hold him, basically, right? Throughout his treatment, and he had to go to the hospital a couple times while he was here, long stints, and he lost kind of muscle mass. He became really weak. He needed help going upstairs and going to the bathroom. And again, this keeps coming up, we're Canadian, where kind of medical aid in dying is legal and accepted and used across Canada and has been for years. And so at one point in December, after another stint in the hospital, and I could tell that he'd been thinking about this because, of course, he was in the hospital by himself, still pandemic rules, no one was visiting. And he had said, I wonder if they have that here in Washington. He wanted to go out on his own terms. He wanted to talk to everyone, say goodbye, and not wait for death, if that made sense. He knew he was dying. He'd gotten so weak that, even people talking about physio, we were already in hospice care by that point, and there wasn't even any talk of physio, even though he'd gotten so weak, because we just knew. It was at that point where I looked into it. Washington is one of several states that has legalized medical aid in dying through the Death with Dignity legislation. And so once he recognized that that was a possibility, he spoke to his doctor about it. It takes 2 weeks, kind of from the first time that you mention it to your doctor to the time that the doctor will authorize a pharmacist to dispense with the medication that you take. And that first discussion with the doctor, we weren't even sure that he was going to make the 2 weeks because he was deteriorating so quickly. And the doctor said, listen, you won't die today. I don't think you'll die tomorrow, but I can't guarantee after that. Because he had seen kind of how he had deteriorated kind of mentally and physically just in the 2 to 3 weeks that we were here before he had made that request.
So for everybody listening who is not familiar with Death with Dignity, this is actually kind of a super hot topic among states and legislation, because the person who wants to take part in Death with Dignity is essentially choosing when to end their life. But there are rules and regulations and protocols for this. So that's what she is talking about. Will you explain to those who also don't know a little bit more about this?
Sure. Admittedly, I don't know all the politics around it. As I mentioned, in Canada, it's been legal for such a long time that it's kind of part of our medical treatment options. But the way that it was explained to me here in Washington when I had to go through the process, for example, is we had to firstly speak to our primary physician, and then we had to get a secondary physician, and they both had to agree that the patient who was requesting this, it had to be the patient, firstly, who requested, it couldn't be anyone else. They had to be of sound mind, and they had to have been given a diagnosis that they were going to die within 6 months. That was clearly not an issue for my husband. As I mentioned, we weren't sure if he was going to live past a week. And this was also in the middle of December by this point. So there was also a bunch of holidays, bunch of holidays in there. So, like pharmacies being closed, and there's only a couple pharmacies that would also be able to dispense with the medication. The doctors had to agree that this person, only had 6 months to live, and that they were of a sound mind. Another thing that we had to figure out was that he was a Washington resident, which we had kind of we still had our house here, so we had him on the lease agreement. So that was enough, because they also don't want people to be coming to Washington to try and take advantage of the legislation because of their own state maybe doesn't have it. And so there was kind of all these different areas which we had to make sure. It's also a very interesting question, kind of religious wise. My husband is not a practicing, or was not a practicing Catholic, but his entire family was a practicing Catholic. And I have subsequently also met other people whose families have used MAID and haven't been able to tell their families. And so there's a lot of kind of extra stuff to go through. One of the things that I found kind of jarring for me was that I had gone from being his primary caregiver, trying to keep him alive and trying to keep him healthy or healthy-ish, trying to keep him safe from kind of catching anything, to someone who is now advocating for him to get these medications so that he could die on his own terms. It was a weird switch to do. But at the same time, I could also see all the agony he was going through. Once that we had started the process, a few days before he died, so this was probably, a week and a half after we started the process, I remember we went for a walk just because it was a nice day in December, and that doesn't happen very often here in Washington. And it was actually sunny out. And he went for maybe like a 30-minute walk, and he vomited beforehand, he vomited after. Like he wasn't well. He couldn't keep down food. He was clearly a man who was dying. I had to help him advocate for what was best for him. And he wanted to die with all of his capacity still with him. So in Washington, the way that it is given is it's a medication. It's a mix of medication that you add into a drink of your choice, and you have to drink it, and the person has to drink it themselves. And so it's not, given in an IV or any other kind of format that anyone else can do. And so even for Francis, because he had trouble keeping food down and even liquids down, we were a bit of in a kind of race against the clock to see if he was even going to be able to take it himself. Every situation is different. Sometimes they say that people can keep the medication in kind of a safe spot and wait and see if they want to use it. And then after a certain amount of time, you'd have to be prescribed again. But for Francis, he knew, and we knew, and he said, this is going to be. He wanted to get through the holiday period, which so his birthday was the 20th of December. There was Christmas Eve and Christmas, and with the Catholic faith, there's a bit more going on Christmas Eve as well. Then our first son was born on New Year's Eve, December 31st. And so he just wanted to get through all those holidays. And then he decided, the earliest we could get the medication was January 2nd. And so he took it on January 3rd after saying goodbye to everyone.
So I've actually been following some of the death with dignity legislation. And of course, like you mentioned, it's different state to state. We live in Utah where it's not a thing currently. And I know that the bill always goes to the legislature every year because one of my friends works there and tells me about it. But it's really interesting. I think it's a very polarizing debate, really. This whole, should you just let fate take care of you, or should you die on your own terms? And the thing that's interesting is if you look at the statistics, every state that has death with dignity also has statistics on how many people actually used the medication. A lot of them don't even get to the point where they are capable of taking it, or at any point. And Addie, correct me if I'm wrong, the person they don't have to take it. They just have it. So they could choose not to take it. And like you said, the person has to administer it to themselves. Nobody else can do it for them. But you can look at the statistics on how people actually do end up dying that do go through all of the steps to get the death with dignity pill. I don't even know what you call it, but get the medication. But a lot of times that's not how they end up dying. And I think that's a big source where people can maybe get misconstrued with what this is. It's like, oh, well, you just moved to a state that has that passed. You ask a doctor for medication and whatever. But there's so many hoops to jump through to get this, like you said. Our friends who have become widows due to an illness, I've asked a couple of them, now that you have lived through watching your person decline, look like a 170-year-old person losing all their bone density, they're so sick. If you had the option and they had wanted it, would you have supported that? Just being curious, because Anita and I are sudden death widows, so we're like, what do people think? And a lot of our friends are strongly religious, and even some of those that are in that category, they're like, I wish that there was something that there was an option for them to try. I don't know if he would have taken it or if we would have chosen to taken it, but watching somebody die and not being in control was also excruciating. So it's definitely like, and to each their own. Whatever people decide to do for their own health, is up to them. But man, what a polarizing and hard thing. It's hard no matter what. And then, like you said, you switched from caretaking, trying to keep him alive, to then this. So I'm curious about your grief process, because as with having a long-term illness or even a short-term illness, like there is grief involved. And then you know he's going to die because he wants to take the pill. So do you think that that helped you process by the time he did die? I know it was like really soon after he got the pill, but your story's so unique. So I'm just curious how that was for you.
Yeah. So here in Washington, it's powdered medication, which is probably a good thing because at that point he wasn't even swallowing pills at that time. So it's just a mix that you mix in with a drink. Um, I knew he was gonna die. Like there was no ifs, ands, or buts about it. Like I had seen him decline at such a fast rate that I knew that if he wasn't going to take the medication, and my husband didn't end up taking all of the medication. He tried and then he kind of gag reflexed and he didn't even take all of it and he died within a very speedy time frame. So in Washington, they have an organization called End of Life Washington, which has volunteers that come out and help you during that period if you would like to. So they actually help. So I didn't think that I would be capable of mixing the medication. It's two different medications that you mix together, and then you mix it with whatever liquid you wanted to drink it with. And I didn't trust myself to do it right because of everything that was going to be happening at that moment. So I asked someone to come and do it for me. And so she'd kind of talked me through it and mentioned how long it often takes for people to, once that you take the medication, for their heart to stop beating. And, my husband was on hospice care at home. And this also, the hospice organization is a Catholic organization. And so they wouldn't be in the house with me while this was happening. Again, as a Canadian, this is very foreign to me that your healthcare here in the US is run by religious organizations. Are the organization who knew we were doing the process, and we were very upfront with it, said that's fine, we have no issues with it, and we will come and kind of state the time of death after you call us. But they wouldn't be, and apparently, sometimes they've had people who will just sit in the driveway and wait. So it's obviously a discussion that goes around, I think, in kind of the community here. But I had someone from this organization come and help, and she was very specific about putting the drink in his hand, for example. Like, so she didn't give it to me to administer or anything like that. It was very kind of clear as to how it was going to be done. I think soon after he made that first request to the doctor, and it was quite fast. So he actually made the request. He mentioned it to the nurse, and the nurse alerted the doctor right away. I think that kind of the medical practice is that once you talk about it, they have to act on it. And they have to start recording kind of the date that it was first requested and all that kind of thing. I think that I had to come to the realization that he wasn't getting better, that there was nothing more that we can do. And we had this discussion with the doctor a few days later, because I also wanted to make sure that we weren't just giving up. And I know, as I mentioned, my husband is a very organized person, and he likes to have control of kind of the things that he's able to have control over. And in his mind, this was his way of controlling the cancer and his own death. And he didn't want the cancer to kind of take over so that he wasn't able to talk to us, so that he was waiting for death, that he was just waiting, lying there, unable to interact with his children and be with his children. He wanted to kind of be able to say goodbye to them and then go on his own terms. And we did tell our two kids, the ones who would understand. And I don't know if that's an upcoming question, but yeah.
I would like to know about that, but I also think it's such an interesting thing, because as humans, we are programmed to stay alive, right? Our primitive brain is built to do everything to stay alive, right? Even in the face of knowing that we're going to die, a lot of times we still fight for that. And it takes a great command of your thinking brain to override that and say, no, I'm not going to try and stay alive. I just think that that's such an interesting battle. I had a grandpa who lived to be 100 years old, and he had signed a DNR. He was 100 years old, right? And then he got an infection, and he had even said he didn't want any antibiotics. But when it came down to it, he's like, yes, I want the antibiotics, And there had to be a discussion like, do you really want the antibiotics? Do you really want to live longer? But in that like split second, yes, because our brains are designed to keep us alive, right? It's just like you were saying, you spent all this time, keep him alive, keep him alive, keep him alive. Oh, actually, you have to use that frontal lobe to really think through it and know that no matter how hard you want to keep somebody alive, it has nothing to do with how hard you want it or how much you want it, right? And I think that's just such an interesting conundrum and an interesting facet of human life to switch from, do everything to stay alive to no, it's not going to happen.
Yeah. Well, and it's as Mel said, is that you can have the medication and you can put it in, a closet, you can put it somewhere and you can leave it and you can wait and see if you actually want to do it or not. Apparently a lot of people also changed the days, like they're feeling really well one day. And so they don't want to take the medication that day. They're having a good day. But then maybe after, a bunch of days, they're like, okay, now here's my decline. I just had a burst of energy one day, but that was just, an anomaly. My husband didn't have that. He really was just declining and declining. An interesting thing. So on his, firstly, American death certificates have so much more information on it than Canadian ones do. Canadian ones basically just say they died on this day. And the ones here have like family and address and race and ethnicity and how they died and the doctor's names. And it's so much more. And so I always feel really odd giving his death certificate to organizations in Canada because I'm like, they're not used to seeing all this. But for example, the leukemia is on here. Like, let's say that he took these medications because in the end, that's what killed him. It was the leukemia that killed him, not, this was an easier step for him to die, yes, but he was going to die regardless. And it was an interesting discussion that I also had with my mother-in-law, who is very Catholic. When we had moved back from Canada to the US in November, she kind of made her way here. She was able to fly into Canada. And so she was able to fly down to help us. It was just the land border that was closed, although most people weren't taking planes anyways. And, we had this discussion before he died, which was, will this affect the life insurance? Will this affect all of these other things because he decided to take these medications? And both of us agreed like really fast. And we're like, you know what? It doesn't matter. Like, would I prolong my husband's death for the life insurance? No, I didn't even know how much it was at that point. And I was like, no, that's not, I think it goes back to kind of the compassion that we have as caregivers and the compassion that I had trying to keep him alive, to try not to make it longer for him. He knew that he was dying. He had started losing, sometimes he couldn't get up to go to the bathroom, or, sometimes he had trouble even just getting up, or he couldn't talk and he couldn't yell out for help or anything like that. Would I prolong that for 4 days longer? Probably not, and so it was a lot of things to go over at kind of those last few days. My husband was always kind of a silver lining kind of person, and he called the last year of his life his bonus year. He said, it was his bonus year, and the speed at which they admitted him to the hospital, like the day that they kind of suspected that he had leukemia and had seen his mass, they admitted him because they were worried that he wasn't going to wake up the next day. Because of the mass on his chest, and they wanted him at the hospital. So he called kind of that extra 15 months his bonus year. He got to see his daughter being born, and he was with us for that. I know that that's what he misses the most, is seeing his children. Seeing me too, I'm going to assume that, but,
So now you're a widowed person who's raising 3 kids. Are you losing your mind? Yes. No. The answer is yes.
Obviously, yes, of course. I mean, like, bedtimes are the worst, and then getting them to school is the worst. And then basically those are like the 2 times that I during the day. We have meltdowns and breakdowns and crying fests. And I don't know how many times I've been like, I'm just one person. How do I tuck 3 kids into bed? And then mornings when like they've decided that they don't want to get out of bed, but they need to go to school. I don't think we're ever on time. Last week we were late all 5 days.
You're speaking my language right now. It's so hard.
My kids have been, because they saw their dad. And I always wanted to use language that was really clear with them. Because I didn't want them to be scared of hospitals and of doctors and of needles, because they're going to need a lot of doctors and hopefully not hospitals, but needles. Just as they're kind of in that immunization stage of life, right, where they get all their childhood shots. So we were always really clear that what, dad had was much more serious, that it was a real sickness that had to be treated by the doctors. And then so when we knew he was dying, we had a discussion with them and told them that essentially that the medication wasn't strong enough, and that the sickness that was in dad's body was stronger than him, even though that dad was so strong. I think I have more books about death than any other subject in my house. We've tried kind of different things on play therapy. I've been seeing a therapist since this all happened. And the kids are getting older now. And so they're more willing to talk about things. They're more willing to kind of show their opinions of where dad's ashes go, and if they're okay with putting dad's ashes like certain places. Sometimes I have an idea of where I want to put them, and they're like, no, I don't want, I'm not ready yet. We can't do it today.
How old is your oldest one now?
He's 8. He just turned 8.
And your youngest is 2?
My youngest is 2. She has less opinions, but she also has less memories, right? It's my 2 older ones who have the memories. And one other thing that I'm going to mention, which is relevant, is that my dad passed away before I was 2. He died of cancer, and this was in the 80s. My mother subsequently remarried, and I have 2 half-sisters and a stepfather that I call my dad. And it was a different era at that time, I think, because my mom never spoke about my dad. I get little tidbits of kind of where he's buried, and I think I have a few photos here and there that my mother had given me over the years. But it wasn't really talked about, I think, because it wasn't my sister's dad. And my stepdad, who was living with us, obviously, and raising me, was, in all intents and purposes, my dad. I think he and my mom married when I was about 5 or 6. And then my sister, my older of the 2 sisters, were born when I was 6. And so it's been interesting knowing what I know as an adult who never knew her dad. And so I had a very interesting relationship kind of with my last name, which no one else had. I had one aunt who had it, who lived in Hong Kong. And I had hung out, I knew them, but I didn't know anything about my dad. I didn't know what he liked. I didn't know, I don't know what his favorite color is. I don't know what his favorite food is. I don't know all of these things. And when I was going through my grief, and I'm still at this point, I can't ask my mom these questions because I don't have space to entertain all of that while I'm also dealing with my grief and the grief of my children. And my children's grief is still quite acute right now, right? Like they're still seeing dads out there and they want their dad and they miss their dad. And one of my kids actually has like a glass piece with Frank's ashes in it at school so he can hold it when he's sad.
Oh.
So, on one hand, I feel as though I turned out fine, that I survived what, knowing that my stepdad was my stepdad and not knowing my biological dad. But at the same time, I was younger while my 2 older children are older and they have photos and they have videos and they have their memories. And so it's been really interesting. Interesting is not the right word because I'd prefer not to have to navigate this, but it's been interesting navigating this with my children because I don't necessarily want them to have the same experience that I did. I want them to know their dad. I want them to know his favorite foods and how he was and how he did things. And You know, and I think before my husband died, I wanted all of those Hollywood things, right? Like I wanted my husband to like write them letters for those big milestone days. And I wanted him to do all of these things that we see in like Hallmark movies, basically. Um, and he couldn't. He left us a video each, one for my kids and one for me. And he broke down after each one because it was so hard for him to do this, and to know that he wasn't going to be there to even, you know, see Zella's first steps or to, you know, wish her a happy first birthday. It was so hard for him to put himself into that. I think I now understand where this kind of romanticized version of, you know, dead parents leaving, you know, what is it like? Anniversary flowers for like 20 years or whatever, right? Like how hard that must also been for anyone who can actually do that. Again, I'm going off tangent. I'm sorry.
It's okay. I think that the what we can distill this down to is this shit is hard, man. It is just,
Yeah.
It is not easy to watch your person go through that. And I do think that it's going to be a really interesting topic to think about, you know, the death with dignity. Not a lot of people had that experience. I think it might have create some feelings in some people because they didn't have that option. Maybe they would have taken that option. Maybe they wouldn't have. But I do think it creates an extra layer to the grief process because for most people, they don't have a role, you know, in the death of their person. And that's not to say like, you killed Francis, but to make a conscious decision that you want to be in control of when a life ends, that's a big responsibility. And I mean, and it just sucks that even has to be something that you had to discuss and make a decision about.
Yeah.
Know?
I mean, I would say that like for example, I have no idea whether I would be able to do it myself, right? Even if I was given the option. I don't know if anyone knows whether they could actually administer it to themselves until that you're in that position.
Right.
But and again, it's legal in Canada, but you know, it's still in discussion in Canada as well. And I was mentioning this to a legislator friend in Canada, and I was like, you know, you don't know whether you want it or not until you actually need it. And at that point, it's not the time that you're trying to get this passed through legislation, right? But, you know, I think that generally it's protected enough that you don't have the wrong people administering it or using it or whatever else. I think there's a fair amount of other medication and drugs that can be used if you, like, there's so many other ways if you're really thinking about it nefariously. But it was a good option for us. And I'm thankful that he had it. Not that necessarily that I had it, but that he had it. And then I was going to say as well is, you know, going through all of this pregnant and then with a newborn, I often forget. I think sometimes people have to remind me and they have to say, you know, don't forget that you went through all this grief and you had a newborn. Most people just have a newborn and they get time to be with their newborn and to take care of their newborn, who I actually call my therapy baby. She's is and still was my therapy baby because I got to like cuddle her. She just, you know, she was like a little blob that I got to cuddle when I needed cuddles. Is that the border was still closed. And so I'd mentioned that I had just moved to Seattle 6 weeks, sorry, before this all happened. By the time that Frank died, it had been about 16 months after we had first moved to Seattle. And so I knew no one here. The only people that we knew were our neighbors because I saw them outside and that was about it. And parents of my kids' friends. And now all I know are widows and those same people. And that was really hard. So it was in the pandemic. No one could come and visit and no one could come and help because most of my friends and family were all across the land border in Vancouver. And so I didn't see anyone who knew us and who knew us from before he'd gotten sick. So I'd kind of known the vibrant and wonderful man that my husband was before he was sick. I didn't see anyone until 8 months after he died.
Wow.
And so I had no support. And so I kind of just like was like, all right, gotta figure this life out, gotta get going. And even as I mentioned, because you had to quarantine for 2 weeks when you went to Canada, it was only when I had dedicated 6 weeks in summer of 2021 in which I could go up to Canada with my kids. We quarantined for 2 weeks. We had 2 weeks of vacation. And then I had to come back to Washington and quarantine for another 2 weeks before the kids could go back to their schools. That was the first time that I saw anyone since his death.
Wow.
And so the pandemic, I found, also stunted kind of this entire grief and mourning period.
Yeah. I think that's a common experience for a lot of people, especially in your same time frame, kind of going through the pandemic. So Addie, what's up next for you? Are you working still? Are you anticipating getting transferred to a new location again soon?
Yeah. So my contract here in Seattle ends this summer. So I will leave this summer. I'm already anticipating that it will be hard to pack up this house and leave, even though he only lived here for a few months. He still has his fingerprints everywhere. Like he set
literal
up the
and
bike.
figurative.
Figuratively, yeah. Well, now I think it has my kids like chocolate covered
pudding face,
pretty much fingertips over everything. But like he's the one who like put up the hooks for the bikes in the garage and put up the pulley system for my kayak, and did all these things around the house that I'm gonna have to take down. And am I gonna put those up in the next place? I don't know. And this, we have moved to so many different places. We've lived in 4 cities together, and each time we found our house together. We went and decided where we were gonna live together. And I don't have that anymore. So I think that's going to
I have an idea. You need to go on that show House Hunters, where they like pretend to find you a house, but it's all just a sham. Maybe we could do it for real.
Yes.
Well, luckily, we're moving back to Canada, and I do have, not to Vancouver, but to another city that I have a fair amount of friends. So I'm going to lean on them quite a bit. I've decided that, they didn't get to help me out 2 years ago. So I'm going to call on all their favors. All of the like, tell me how I can help is going to be like, all right, this is how you're going to help. You're going to help me unpack my house. You're going to help me find my house. You're going to help me winterize my car. You're going to help me do all these things. And so I'm going to call on all those favors, and I have no qualms about it.
Last important question. Favorite cheese, go.
Those of you who have known me on the Facebook page will know that I put my husband's favorite appetizer on the recipe. It's the melted brie, and it's got like port and cranberries and pine nuts and olives, and it's absolutely delicious. And I now make it every year for our wedding anniversary, regardless of where I am, and so I can share that with people. And then also our wedding cake was wheels of cheese. I had the cheese, the wheels of cheese. That was our wedding cake. So those were like hard cheeses. And my favorite was, there's an Irish Cashel cheese, which is a blue cheese from Ireland, and that one's wonderful. And so I love cheese. I don't want another wedding, but I'd like another wedding cake made of cheese.
I'd like another wheel of cheese, please. All right. Pretty well, much, ask your friends when you're getting your car winterized, be like, and can I have a wheel of cheese? Mm-hmm. I mean, really play it up. See what you can get from them.
You could have every year on your anniversary, like request that people make you a wedding cake of cheese, but it's just not a wedding.
Oh, that's a lot of cheese though for one person, or even 4 people.
Maybe she'll want it.
Well, then we'll just have a party every year.
Yeah. Adeline, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been fascinating to talk to you about your experience and about your life and your adventures. And we wish you the best on your upcoming adventures with your kids, and hope that you can stay sane as you're going through this. And hopefully you get to eat some poutine when you go back to Canada. Remember to check out our Patreon if you want to keep the podcast going. It's patreon.com/WWDN.
If you'd like to buy us tacos, please go to buymeacoffee.com/widowwedonoww.
And if you would be so kind as to leave a 5-star rating and review for us on Apple Podcasts, that really helps people to find the podcast when they need to. And if you want to find Adeline, you find her in the Facebook group, the Widow Wives Club. It's our private Facebook group. You just have to answer all the questions. And until we get to talk to you again, I'm Anita.
I'm Mel.
I'm Adeline.
And we are just two young widows and a young widow who's adventuring around the world carrying a block of cheese. And we're all just trying to figure out, widow,
We
do.
This is my favorite thing to discuss with you.
Tell me, what is it?
One of my favorite things. I do enjoy tacos and cheese and dogs. This is about how you cannot pay hundreds and hundreds of dollars for a phone plan, especially when you're a widow, your person is dead, you might have kids, you might need another option, and you just want your phone to work, you want unlimited texting and service, and you want it to be like $25 a month.
It blows my mind that they have plans that start at $15 a month. That is so cheap. And the cool thing is it uses other 5G networks, and so you don't have to pay extra for that, and you still get great service.
Yep, Anita and I have traveled all over, and I have used my phone. So I highly recommend it, and my mom's even on it. When my dad died, we put his phone down to the cheapest plan, which is $15 a month. And I think my mom's on the $20 a month plan, and it's so worth it. It's so much cheaper than what we were all paying before. So I highly recommend it if you're on a budget or not. Who cares? Ryan Reynolds is in charge of the company, and they send you free stickers with Ryan Reynolds temporary tattoos. It's kind of the best. So if somebody wants to sign up, what can they do, Anita?
Go to trymintmobile.com/WWDN. Seriously, you guys, such a great idea. Save yourself some money.
And if you're worried about losing data or having any changes with your phone, not going to happen. They walk you through it. Everything's fine. It's the easiest process of all time. Again, that's
trymintmobile.com/WWDN.